Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now back in October of 2022, Intel launched the ARC A750 and A770. These came shortly after the disappointing entry-level A380, which offered pretty weak performance, not helped by driver issues as well as problems in older games. I consider myself a pretty early adopter of ARC. I really wanted Intel to succeed in the discrete GPU space, and I actually bought an A750 shortly after launch. I had a great time playing around with it, more so of course in newer DX12 or Vulkan based titles as part of my rebar compatible machine. I also managed to alleviate some of the performance problems I was facing in older games by using DXVK, a DirectX to Vulkan translation layer. I remember saying that the success of these cards was heavily dependent on regular meaningful driver updates, and to be honest my impressions of my A750 only got more positive as time went on. I had planned on testing the A770 as well, but I never got round to it until today. This is the 16GB Acer Predator BiFrost A770. There are 8GB A770s out there, but they have always seemed pointless in a world where the 8GB A750 exists. The Acer A770 is an interesting looking card. It's got a small metal fan in the centre as well as a vapour chamber and a large fan towards the end. It's like a hybrid laptop/desktop cooling solution on a desktop card. All I know is that even at idle it's pretty audible, but because of this it doesn't sound much louder under load. I think you can get Intel software and control fan curves and lighting. Speaking of which, the RGB looks good. Bifrost is a burning rainbow bridge in Norse mythology, and we clearly have the rainbow, but hopefully no burning. Today's video is more of a test of performance and stability in 2025, something ARC cards struggled with in certain games at launch, especially in but not limited to older ones, but we'll start there today. I've paired this with an i7-12700F and resizable bar is enabled, something that's still important for the optimal experience. The DX11 based Bioshock Infinite is up first. It ran flawlessly, no issues at all here, hundreds of frames per second with the Ultra preset. Visually this is still holding up. I love the art style of Bioshock games. I tested Grand Theft Auto 4 on my A750 back in 2022 and it stuttered quite a bit with DX9, though this was never an ARC exclusive issue. I use Fusion Fix these days to improve gameplay and visual features, but with or without it, GTA 4 runs pretty smoothly with the default DX9 mode enabled. Half-Life 2 also runs with DX9 and with the maximum settings, I have no complaints. The frame times were flawless. Just look at the graph on screen. You might think that testing older games is a bit pointless. Of course they're going to run really well on a modern card, right? Well, back in the very early days of ARC, this wasn't a guarantee. Maybe the fixes and improvements are old news to some by now, but as a first-time A770 owner and user, I wanted to test a few of my aging favourites first. But let's move on to our modern library of games. Apex Legends made the switch from DX11 to DX12 a while ago. It did have a few problems on ARC back in the day with DX11 mode. Now though, it runs absolutely fine. We have DX12 here by default. Of course, I don't even think we can choose DX11, otherwise I would have done that. We have the highest settings and TSAA enabled for 254 frames per second, a 1% of 167 and a 0.1% of 142. Now it wasn't just DX11 and older games that had a few problems on ARC back in the day. I do seem to recall there being reports of some stability and crashing issues even with newer releases, so it's well worth a revisit in 2025. What I will say though is that with the release of the B580 and B570, well, it sort of makes this thing a little less attractive, but it depends on the pricing where you live really, not just in comparison to other ARC cards but AMD and Nvidia alternatives. We'll try Baldur's Gate 3 next. This has an option to run in DX11 or Vulkan. I always choose Vulkan, to be honest. With the high preset here and XeSS native, we were seeing over 90 frames per second. Just about 91 was the average. Now we can use TAA. I think SMAA is available. as well, but XeSS native looks a bit better. It does impact the performance a little bit. Instead of around 98, 99 FPS with TAA, we're seeing just over 90 now, but the game definitely looks sharper for it, so I think it's worth the performance sacrifice considering we don't see any drops below 60. This isn't exactly a fast-paced title, so I don't think we need to get massive amounts of frame rates to enjoy it. I certainly don't. Next up we have the newly released Battlefield 6 at 1080p of course with the medium preset and TAA enabled here. Now I did start off with the high preset and we still saw over 60 frames per second, but there were a few dips and drops towards the low 60s with high, and I think just for a sort of safety net, for a bit more peace of mind, a little more leeway in terms of that performance, you're going to want to stick with medium here. 89 FPS was the average, the 1% low was 69, very nice, and the 0.1% low was 62. I wasn't sure how well Battlefield 6 would run on an ARC card, but an A380 I think is listed as the minimum spec GPU, and we'll be testing that very shortly as well. But as far as the A770 goes, 1080p with the medium settings, yeah, can't really complain. Now when it comes to Borderlands 4, I don't really get good performance on any of my hardware, and that really is no exception with the ARC A770 here. 49 frames per second, 42 as that 1% low, and 26 as that 0.1% figure. I don't think this is particularly a bad result for the ARC, especially when considering this doesn't run too well on most of my Nvidia or AMD cards, my mid-range cards anyway. Now Counter-Strike Global Offensive ran pretty poorly on ARC when I originally tested the cards. These days of course we have CS2, DX11, and it runs fine. There are no complaints here, very high preset with AA off by default. 8x MSAA will be enabled, but I don't really think we need that here, and so switching that off gave us well over 200 frames per second, 266 overall, 1% low of 161, a 0.1% low of 99. Now of course this is a ray tracing capable card, and so I wanted to test the game with and without ray tracing in Cyberpunk 2077 with the high preset, high textures and high crowds. With the A770, no ray tracing enabled here, we saw 78 frames per second, a 1% low of 64 and a 0.1% low of 60. So this was actually really smooth, really consistent, can't complain here at all, no major drops or stutters, and a pretty nice gameplay experience to be fair. Would I recommend turning on ray tracing with an ARC card? Well, it isn't a totally unplayable experience, far from it in fact. I was expecting worse, but even with the RT Ultra preset and XeSS2 set to auto mode, we saw 58 frames per second. I wasn't sure whether to select balance performance when it came to the upscaling, so I just set it to auto, let the game do its thing, and we saw 58 frames per second with a 1% low of 48 and a 0.1% low of 45. So really smooth, really consistent. I think the 16 gigs of VRAM is helping here. Now personally I'd probably play with ray tracing turned off. I do that with any sort of lower mid-range card, to be honest. If I was using a 3060 or 4060 I turn ray tracing off, and the A770 is no exception. But it is playable, as you can see here. You're not going to get a flawless 60 FPS. You might do with lower ray tracing settings, but if you want to enable all the effects like I've done so here, you're going to be looking at sub 60 FPS pretty much all of the time, but it doesn't feel too bad at all. Now when it came to Doom the Dark Ages, I have a feeling this isn't running as well as it should be. This is using Vulkan, which is fine, but we've had to resort to the lowest settings with XeSS quality in order to hit at least 60 frames per second. 70 was the average, but when I tried running this at native resolution, it was like a 40 to 50 frames per second experience. I'm not sure whether or not it's because of the older ARC architecture or the drivers or what. Don't get me wrong, it was smooth and the average and percentile lows were fine. There were no hiccups, performance drops, stutters, inconsistencies, anything like that. As you can see, the frame time graph is looking pretty good, but I just feel like we're getting lower performance than we should be overall. Maybe it's just me, maybe I'm wrong. When it comes to GTA 5, of course, we can also make use of the ray tracing features because I am using the enhanced version. I went with the high RT preset, but I also enabled RTGI or Ray Trace Global Illumination here. I set this to high as well. Now RTGI is the option that's going to make all of the newly added features stand out. Really, it's the biggest transformation in terms of visuals. I also went with FSR3 native, so native 1080p. Looks better than TAA, which can look a bit blurry even with the sharpness turned up. And although we do drop a few frames over TAA, 5 to 10 FPS, we do have those to spare, and it's well worth it, I think, for the visual clarity. For Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, we have 1080p, of course, with the high preset and SMAA2TX for 94 frames per second. The difference between high and ultra in terms of performance is quite significant, especially when using this card, but visually I don't think it looks too different. Now, I stuck with 1080p instead of pushing it harder or to a higher resolution today because I was mainly looking for inconsistencies and performance problems with the ARC card, and these would have been present regardless of resolution. I also feel that in the more demanding of games, 1080p is your best bet in 2025. There are going to be a few titles whereby 1440p, especially with upscaling, is going to be more than doable. But this was my preference, so I stuck with it. 1080p with a high preset here, 94 FPS, and again, pretty consistent percentile lows. The frame time graph that you're seeing on screen is also very smooth here. As you can see, we are utilising more than 8 gigs of VRAM. Now, this is something quite common in a lot of today's tested games, so glad I got the 16 gig version. I don't think there's an 8 gig version of this Acer card, but I'd suggest the 16 gig one anyway. If not, just go with the A750. Let's finalise with Oblivion Remastered, another pretty troublesome PC release in terms of performance, especially for lower end or mid-range hardware. That said, on the A770, it is playable with the low preset, high reflections to improve the quality of the water over there, and we also have XeSS quality to boost us to over 60 frames per second. 62 was the average. The 1% low was 49 and the 0.1% low was 19. Nothing out of the ordinary in terms of the percentile lows. Overall then, the ARC A770 does a fine job in 2025. We can also make use of ray tracing if we want to in certain titles, of course, and over this past week I've had no issues whatsoever. Like I said, probably old news for some, but I haven't tested the A770 before. I wanted to try it out and I've been pretty happy with it. Something I'd also like to mention is the newly released B570 and B580. We spoke about that briefly with the Apex Legends result earlier. And the B570, despite being a 10 gig card, from what I've seen in benchmarks at the time of release, that will outperform this thing on average. I think it's going to depend on the game. Of course, we have less VRAM there too. The B580 is a 12 gig card. That's going to do even better. Hopefully I can get all of these together and do one big ARC comparison in 2025. But this one was more about testing the stability and performance in a handful of titles. And yeah, I'm pretty pleased with it. I've also wanted one of these cards for ages because it just looks quite unique. I haven't really seen any other card that looks like this. I think there might be an RX 7600 from Acer with the same style cooler. Maybe we'll find one of those someday too. But as for this one, thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts down below. Let me know if you use an ARC card in 2025. And hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one when we'll be back with some more Battlefield 6 tests.